official podcast of the Jacksonville Public Library.
I'm Hurley.
And I'm Jenna.
Today we're going to celebrate Black History Month with one of our favorite authors in town. His name is Rodney Hurst Sr. He's written two incredible books. One is called It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke. The other is titled Unless We Tell It, It Never Gets Told.
Yeah, Rodney is... this is my first time actually meeting him personally, but I've heard so much about him. He's done so many things here at the library, promoting his books for one, and also just doing with our exhibit. He did a lot of stuff with Axe Handle Saturday. He has a full exhibit with photos and all kinds of stuff. So he was awesome. I was like, you'll see I didn't speak that much because I was just like entranced in listening to his stories. It's so crazy.
His stories are intense. He lived through an enormous racial massacre here in Jacksonville called Axe Handle Saturday, which is something, I grew up in Jacksonville and we did not learn about this in school ever. I didn't learn about it until I was in college taking an African American literature course. And It's ridiculous that these things happened right across the street from where we're sitting right now in the main library. Of course, Rodney is going to tell us all about them in his own words. So here he is, Mr. Hurst. Mr. Hurst, thank you so much for joining us today.
My
We
pleasure.
appreciate your time. Yeah. So I'd love to start off having you read a little bit from your book, your first book, correct? It was
Yes.
Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke.
Yes.
If you could read that passage for chapter 1, that'd be great.
At what age do you know about racism to recognize it? For many, the answer varies because the learning process actually begins at birth and continues through a series of ever-expanding experiences. When it is encountered as children, young blacks might not be able to identify, classify, or understand it, but they know it just as sure as they know their names. I don't know when I understood racism, but when I first experienced it, I knew.
Thank you. What a powerful passage. So you wrote this book a while back, and it's been, really heralded as a wonderful history text for Jacksonville's history. Tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it.
Well, I wrote the book because I was angry. I don't like doing panel discussions because when you have 3, 4, 5 persons on a panel and they are all experts, and yet I'm there to hear one person, I should not have to listen to 3 or 4 other persons before they get back to that person who is an acknowledged expert. So I usually turn down speaking on panel discussions. But I was at the Ritz Theater and Museum, and Carol Alexander and Lydia Stewart asked me to appear on a panel about Axe Handle Saturday. And I told them no. And they persisted, and I eventually said yes. And when I got to the Ritz that Saturday, there were 15 people who were going to be on the panel. And I spent half of my time correcting them because their information about Axe Handle Saturday was incorrect. They were not there. Many of my friends who were there in the audience laughed at me afterwards because they could see me getting upset. And a close friend of mine said, "It serves you right because you can tell the story and you have not told it since you were the president of the Youth Council and you led the sit-in." So I went home that night and I started writing a book whose working title was Axe Handle Saturday. But when I got ready to submit my paperwork to the Library of Congress for copyright, I changed the title from Axe Handle Saturday to It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, because we did not sit in just to eat a sandwich and to drink a beverage. It was because of the insult by white store owners and the kind of pervasive racism that existed at that time during these days of abject segregation. You were invited as a black shopper to come into a store and spend your money throughout the store except one designated area of the store where the store owner and the store manager says, "We want your money, but you can't spend it over there." And we felt that was insulting. So the whole concept of it was never about a hot dog and a Coke, it was about human dignity and respect. And that was the basis of the book. Sit-in demonstrations, that wave of sit-in demonstrations started earlier that year in Greensboro, North Carolina, February 1st, by 4 students from North Carolina A&T. And they were college students. We were high school students. Most of the other sit-in demonstrations throughout the country were conducted by college students. But 95 to 98% of the students here in Jacksonville were from high schools.
And that includes yourself, correct?
Yes, I had just graduated from high school earlier that summer.
Right.
This was August. I had graduated from high school in June.
Right, and you've been organizing change in the community, like you said, since you were young. Tell us about how you got your start as a civil rights activist.
Well, from the day I went into Mr. Pearson's class, Mr. Rutledge Pearson, who was my 8th grade American history teacher, who said to his class of 8th grade Negro students in a Negro junior high school as a part of the Negro division of the Duval County Public School System, again during these days of segregation, he would talk about the American history textbook that was approved for this Negro class. And after he explained what the book entailed, he told us to leave the book at home because Mr. Pearson did not teach American history from the racist and segregated viewpoints of white textbook authors and historians who only saw fit to include the names of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. So we were taught in his 8th grade class an inclusive American history. He was also the advisor to the Jacksonville Youth Council NAACP. And one of the things that he would constantly say to us in 1955, that freedom is not free. If you are not a part of the solution, you are a part of the problem. And he would encourage us to join the Youth Council NAACP. That was 64 years ago.
Wow, and that's not something you hear teachers encouraging their students to do today very often, let alone 64 years ago.
So at age 11, I started my journey both in understanding civil rights, being proud of being a black person, and also studying black history of Jacksonville.
Wonderful. So as we've talked about, your book, It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, is an account of Axe Handle Saturday. And you open this book by saying that you want to share a facet of Jacksonville's history that very few are willing to discuss, let alone embrace. Could you tell us what transpired that day since you were there? It's a day in Jacksonville's history, like you said, that very few are willing to discuss.
Well, if we go back to 2 weeks earlier, August 13th, 1960, the first sit-in on that Saturday. It's the picture of the closed lunch counter and Alton Yates and I talking with several members of the press, 3 white members of the press and 2 persons who were associated with the Florida Star, black weekly newspaper, including the editor. After that first day, the press, including that first day, the press did not cover anything about axe handles, anything about the sit-ins. We sat in at lunch counters throughout downtown Jacksonville for 2 weeks. There was nothing in the local newspapers. There were reporters in town from other newspapers and other news organizations because even though it was the summer with the sit-ins starting in February of that year, it was still an extension of everything else that happened in 1960 with sit-ins and other demonstrations. But the local press did not cover it. They blacked out all news about what was happening.
And why did they do that?
They decided they weren't going to cover it. In fact, one of the opinion editors, column writers for the Florida Times Union went back and talked to some of the reporters who were in the industry at that time, both at Channel 4, Channel 12, and the Times-Union, and they were told not to, and he reported it, they were told not to write anything. Don't take your cameras out, don't take pictures, anything. So it was part of what we considered and what I have internalized as the racism in the media. There were no black reporters at that time at either the television stations then or at the Times-Union. The Times-Union had a section called News for and About the Colored People of Jacksonville.
Wow.
Which was where all of the black news was contained. But those two persons principally who worked in that section did not have the kinds of assignment that would send them out to cover something like this. When Axe Handle Saturday occurred and all of a sudden Jacksonville was in the eye of national media, and reporters were coming into Jacksonville from all over the country. And as is their procedure, they get in touch with local members of the press to ask them, since they are from out of town, who should we talk to, who should we call? And many of those members of the press could not tell them. So when this article was written 50 years later, they talked about how embarrassing it was. They were in the media, and their colleagues from outside, from national news,
Oh, yeah, that's pretty shameful.
they could not tell them who to talk to. We had a mass meeting that day. Well, let me go back a bit. We sat in at all of the lunch counters downtown, Grant and Cress, which were on the corner of Adams and Main Street, McCrory's on the corner of Hogan and
Not
Bay
too far
Street.
from where we're sitting right now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, in the main library.
The Grant's was right around the corner. Cohen Brothers was diagonally across from the library in the St. James building, which is now where City Hall is.
Mm-hmm.
Cohen Brothers had both a lunch counter and a restaurant. And then, of course, Woolworth's, which was probably the largest department store where the federal courthouse is now. Woolworth had, as you walked into the store to the left, a white lunch counter that had 84 seats. At the rear of the store, and you could not even see it as you walked in, was the Negro or the colored lunch counter, which had 15 seats. When we sat in at the white lunch counter at Woolworth's on that Saturday, one of the waitresses came and told us that you can't sit there, you're in the wrong place, your lunch counter is at the back of the store. We would always purchase something when we would go into a store, no matter what store we were going to sit in that day. We would always purchase something in the store prior to sitting in to show that they accepted our money at one counter but would not accept it at another counter. And we did that then, and we said to the waitress, we want to be served. Well, you can't be served here. So finally the manager came over and said whatever.
And how old were you at this point?
I was 16.
16, okay.
And they closed the lunch counter. Well, Woolworth served fresh lunches. There were no microwaves or convection ovens at that time. So when whites could not eat their fresh lunches, could not get to the lunch counter because they closed the lunch counters, then there was a veritable throng of whites who stood behind us yelling the racial epithets, as you can imagine. And we always sat longer than the lunch period because we didn't want, if we sat for 20, 30 minutes and got up, then they would open up the lunch counter again. If they wanted to practice racism and segregation, we were going to make it expensive for them to do that. And as we left, we were stuck with pins and ladies' high heels on our shoes, and that was the ordinary.
It was ordinary.
it was ordinary. I mean, we endured that every day. We expected that. We expected the kinds of racial epithets. We expected. One day we were sitting at Woolworth's, and a gentleman who we've got a picture of, who was walking with a cane that had a rubber tip on it, wooden cane, and he leaned up against one of the persons he was with, and he whittled the end of the cane to a sharp point, and he walked behind each of us, sticking us in the back with his now pointed walking cane. During this entire time, there were no police protection around. There were no police officers, not in uniform. We later found out that there were plainclothes policemen who had taken pictures of all of us and who had followed some of us. We had a white student from Florida State in the second week of the demonstrations to sit in with us. And it so infuriated the whites because then they figured out that this nigger-loving racial agitator was the one who was involved in rousing up our Negro citizens to get them to do this. And some construction workers came into Woolworth that day. They were building the Florida National Bank building, which was right on the corner of Monroe and Hogan at the time, which is the Ed Ball building now. And the construction workers came and stood right behind me. Parker was 2 persons over from me, and they stood there. And as it turned out, some black teenagers walked over to Parker, got him to leave with them, formed a circle around him, and walked him out of Woolworth's to safety. We are convinced, I am convinced, that something would have happened to him that day.
And Parker was the one from FSU.
Parker was the white student from FSU. The day of Axe Handle Saturday, Dr. Gerardo, who also sat in with us that day, later on that day, went with Mr. Pearson. Mr. Pearson had gotten a call from somebody who said that there were some strange happenings at Heman Park. And when Mr. Pearson got to Heman Park, he said that there were white men in Confederate uniforms and they were passing out free axe handles. We met at the Laura Street Presbyterian Church Youth Center, which was on Laura Street between State and Union, which was Mr. Pearson's church. It is now the Woodlawn Presbyterian Church. They moved from the downtown area out to suburban Jacksonville. And we would always have our youth council meetings and would leave from there walking downtown for sit-ins. And that day, that morning, Mr. Pearson explained what he and Dr. Gerardo had seen. Dr. Gerardo was a student, a dental student at Howard University. And we would not let Parker sit in with us that day. And we did not sit in at Woolworth's. We went to Grant's. And when the persons who had the axe handles found out that we were at Grant's, then a big rush down Grant's, down
about
Adams Street.
About how many
200,
people? Wow.
200 whites with axe handles and baseball bats.
Oh, gosh.
As I walked out of Grant's in this kind of surreal panorama, there was a news photographer on top of a car that was knocked off the car by one of the persons with the axe handles. The film that he shot that he had forgotten about was later found. It was used in a documentary called Axe Handle Saturday 50 Years Later, and it's the only film footage of whites walking through Laura Street and Adams Street with axe handles. When the word got back about what was happening downtown to Ashley Street, which was the center of the black business district about 5 or 6 blocks away from downtown, and blacks started making their way from this part of the black business district to downtown, then policemen came from everywhere and blocked off downtown. We later found out from an FBI informant that the Klan had a meeting at one of Jacksonville's downtown hotels, the Mayflower Hotel. And they had determined that they were going to use the sit-ins to start a race war in Jacksonville. So this guy who was an FBI informant, he reported everything to his FBI handler. The handler put the report on the desk of Sheriff Dale Carson. Jacksonville was not consolidated at that time, so you had a police department headed by a chief of police, and you had a county sheriff's department headed by a county patrolman headed by a sheriff. And that report was intercepted by one of Dale Carson's lieutenants, who was a member of the Klan. But we also found out that there were National Guard units on standby in St. Augustine and also at Camp Blanding. So they knew that there was the potential for something to happen, and they knew that there could be some violence, but still there was no presence of police to deter the violence. So they, in effect, wanted the violence to happen. That's my editorial opinion of what happened that day. The fact that the newspaper and the television stations did not cover anything about it. The next day in the Times-Union on the 28th, there was a short article in the B section of the paper that said something like, "Racial skirmish quelled." In subsequent interviews with Hayden Burns, who was the mayor, he said, nothing happened, the police had everything under control. And at the same time, the national media, the national black press was saying Jacksonville with a full-blown riot with many people hurt. There were 3 people officially killed that we later found out from the FBI. But Jacksonville did nothing.
And our paper did not say anything about the 200 people holding axe handles and baseball bats.
No, nothing at all. In fact, the picture that I use on the cover of my book and the picture of that first sit-in, that was when they closed the lunch counters, that was a picture taken with a graduation gift that I got, which was a Brownie camera. And that is not a news photo. That is a photo that was taken by a friend, and my grandmother kept that picture in a file with other newspaper clippings and other stuff until she died in the mid-'80s. But the pictures that I use in the book, some were from the Pittsburgh Courier and the Florida Star. One picture of Charlie Griffin, who was beaten that day, with a black and white picture with blood on the front of his shirt, comes from Life magazine. But other than that, there were no local pictures or local film footage of what happened that day.
Wow. You wrote another book, too, in 2015 called Unless We Tell It, It Never Gets Told. What was your goal in writing this book? Tell us a little bit about it.
As I traveled on speaking engagements and at book festivals, there were those who, because I give little snippets in the first book about when I met Thurgood Marshall or when I met A. Philip Randolph or talking with Roy Wilkins. And people would ask about different questions. They ask, is it true that Jacksonville has a school named for the founder of the Ku Klux Klan? So one of the things that I decided to do, because Jacksonville's black history and civil rights history, as rich as it is is really not told. It does not unfold either in the school system or in the library systems or in communities. James Weldon Johnson, who helped found the Harlem Renaissance, who was the first black lawyer, certified lawyer in the state of Florida, who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sang here in Jacksonville on the campus of Bethel Church, A. Philip Randolph, and his coordinating the March on Washington and his challenging both President Roosevelt to integrate the federal workforce and President Truman to integrate the military. Bob Hayes, who ran in the Olympics, a graduate of one of the black high schools, went to Florida A&M, who ran in the Olympics in 1964, set a world record in the 100-yard dash, anchored the 400-meter relay, got the baton in next to last place, with the commentator saying America was going to lose, and he caught everything in front of him. And in fact, what he said was that I caught the United Nations because it was the Olympics. Went on to play for the Dallas Cowboys, and when the Cowboys won the Super Bowl and he was a member of that team, he became the only man in the history of sport to have both a Super Bowl championship ring and an Olympic gold medal. Johnetta Betch Cole, who is president emerita of both Spelman and Bennett, and who, until she retired in 2017, was the director of the Smithsonian African American Museum. Throughout Jacksonville's history, you have outstanding people. Bethel Baptist Church, one of the pastors of Bethel was Reverend Matthew William Gilbert, high school named for him. He eventually became the president of Florida Baptist Academy, which is now Florida Memorial University in Miami. And the person who followed him was Reverend John Milton Waldron, who not only built both of the structures, the one that's standing now, and another beautiful structure which was destroyed in the fire of 1901, but he became the treasurer of the Niagara movement, and he was one of the founders of the NAACP. So Jacksonville has that kind of rich history.
And it's not told
and
often
it's not
enough.
told, and that's the title of the book. Unless we tell it, it never gets told. And I was saying to you, black teachers and academics and others, we have a responsibility to tell it. Mr. Pearson taught us black history. He told what needed to be told about black history, about civil rights history. And it was not unfettered with anything sanitized. We understood what happened in the Montgomery bus boycott. We understood the Ruby McCullum case. We understood what happened to Harry T. Moore and his wife Harriet. So these were things that I internalized at a very early age as a result of a very courageous and brave black junior high school teacher who decided he wanted his students to understand their legacy as black Americans.
Wow, thank goodness for Mr. Pearson. Yes, absolutely. What motivates you to focus your efforts on Jacksonville specifically?
Well, Jacksonville is my hometown. I spent 4 years in the military, and even though I had job offers, I was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in stat services, which was the beginning at that time in the early 60s of the punch card accounting machines with the verifier and the sorter and all of these early computer machines. So I could have worked in Dallas or Fort Worth and stayed there. Jacksonville was my hometown, and I wanted to come back. No matter where you go as a black person, you've got to deal with racism. And even though it is uncomfortable to talk about, and because, in fact, in my second book, I call American history inaccurate and dishonest, because we really don't understand some things. We I say to college students and young people today that they are fed a tasteless and blandless diet of pablum and baby food that's called American history, because it's in the book and the teachers teach what's in the book, yet it's incorrect. And one of the classic examples that I usually start off with, we give credit to Christopher Columbus for discovering America, and he never set foot in the continental United States. So it's that kind of dishonesty that we have to deal with. So when we talk about when I talk to young blacks about who you are, and when I talk to black and white students, and I say to everyone who will listen, I am an advocate for who I am, for my blackness, because when I look in the mirror, I see a black face looking back at me. That does not mean I'm anti-white. It means that I am an advocate for who I am. And one of the things that I feel is absolutely necessary is that we talk about those issues no matter how uncomfortable they are. 1959, the Duval County School Board named a high school, a brand new high school in Jacksonville, after Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a slave trader, who was called the Fort Pillow Butcher, who was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan, who was the first imperial wizard of the Klan. There was no reason to do that other than that was their racist response to the Brown decision. Usually there are some redeeming values that you use when you name a school after someone. But that's not what happened in Jacksonville. But finally, in 2013, the students changed the name of their school. And thankfully, I was a part of that process.
Oh, wow, how wonderful.
That's crazy. It took so long.
I know.
In the process that the school board had started was when you would rename a school, there is a scripted procedure to follow. And the last part of changing the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest was a panel discussion in the auditorium. Which is
not your favorite thing.
Not my favorite thing. In the auditorium, and sitting in the auditorium were the 11th and 12th graders, and still in their homerooms were the 9th and 10th graders, and they received a closed circuit feed on the television, so they were watching in their classrooms while we were talking about Nathan Bedford Forrest live. And then after the panel discussion, then the students would vote whether to keep the name or whether to change the name. There were two persons on the panel who were in favor of keeping the names and the name, and there were two persons on the panel, me and a professor from Florida Junior College of Florida, State College at Jacksonville, who were in favor of changing the name.
The two who wanted to keep the name, what was their reasoning?
One was the head of the Nathan Bedford Forrest Historical Society, and then another was a graduate of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And when we started off, the gentleman who was the president of the Nathan Bedford Forrest Historical Society, he started off by saying, well, it was not a debate. He kind of characterized it as a debate. And he started off by saying, my opponent will tell you that Nathan Bedford Forrest was a slave owner. Well, yes, that is true, but remember, slavery was legal at that time. And my opponent will tell you that Nathan Bedford Forrest was the Fort Pillow Butcher. And yes, it says that his men killed 300 black men, women, and children under flag of surrender. But when General Forrest found out what they did, he made them stop after 300 people were dead. Mm-hmm. And my opponent will tell you that Nathan Bedford Forrest was one of the founders of the Klan and that he was the first imperial wizard. Well, understand that the Klan was a social organization, and when he found out that the Klan was not involved in social activities, he said, remove his name as being the imperial wizard of the Klan. That was after 7 years. So I started off by apologizing to the students there at Forest that an adult school board put them in a position for more than 50 years having to deal with a namesake of their school who had no redeeming value, no graces whatsoever that they could feel proud about. And I explained to them why, and I explained to them what slavery was about, and I explained to them how much money Nathan Bedford Forrest made after slavery, and I explained what happened at Fort Pillow when the men, women, and children were killed, and I explained to them some of the things he did leading the Klan. So the whole process dealt with, bottom line, why? Why would the school board do this? The students voted 67% to 33%.
Wow.
To change the name. The superintendent asked me to come to the school board meeting that Monday, and ironically, most of the school board members, instead of them standing up and saying, I think we needed to change the name, they all said, because they knew what the student vote was, they said, I'm not venturing my own opinion, I just agree with the students. Well, if the students said that as a member of a body politic, why not say, yes, they needed to change the name? And see, one of the problems with Jacksonville is that Jacksonville is damned and determined that it is not going to move into the 21st century. Its feet might be in the 21st century, but its head is going to remain in the 50s and the 60s. And there were other cities, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Atlanta. They were at the same place Jacksonville was back in the 50s. Yet they dealt with a lot of those problems, a lot of their racial problems head on. When we asked Mayor Hayden Burns to appoint a biracial committee, he said, I am a segregationist. Biracial means integration. If I appoint a biracial committee, then those persons who know me as being a segregationist will now think that I am an integrationist. So I'm not going to appoint a biracial committee. And we asked him to appoint a biracial committee so that black folk and white folk can sit down at a conference table and discuss issues. This came before, but also after Axe Handle Saturday, and we were not fooling ourselves that we could solve problems immediately, but certainly we could start working on those problems. So he would not appoint one. In fact, one of the state legislators who was asked to serve by the pastor of Snyder Memorial Church right across the street from the library, Reverend Gisler. He was a member of Snyder Memorial, and he told Reverend Gisler he will not serve on any group with that communist Youth Council president and his communist advisor who were engaged in communist activities. But the white business community, the NAACP, the White Ministerial Alliance, the Black Ministerial Alliance appointed folk, and we met at Snyder Memorial. It was not an official sanctioned group. We met at Snyder Memorial. 5 months of acrimonious meetings. A lot of the whites had never sat across the conference table from black folk in 1960. One of the things on the agenda, one of the things we wanted to discuss was why there were no black firemen, why there were no black bus drivers, why there were no black salespeople. And the black policemen in Jacksonville could not arrest white folk.
Really?
That was a rule?
Yes.
It was a law.
Yeah, that was part of the process. If they found someone white who was breaking the law, they had to call their white sergeant.
Holy cow.
Before the arrest could be consummated. But they invited a member of the Duval County Civil Service Board to come and explain and talk about Jacksonville not having black firemen. And this gentleman started off by saying, everyone knows that blacks are afraid of heights. And since firemen have to climb ladders, and since blacks would not climb ladders because they are afraid of heights, then we don't have black firemen because blacks are afraid of heights.
That is so
and
absurd.
Blacks could not climb ladders.
This was said at a meeting.
It's 1960. This was part of the process. Now, interestingly, this was not covered by the media, and I don't remember nor do I recall if it was closed to the press. Very few things were. The press just made a decision that they just would not cover some things. Well, after 5 weeks or so, 5 months or so, a decision was made to integrate the lunch counters. We were boycotting downtown. We had started the sit-ins again. So
How long after Axe Handle Saturday was this?
this is a couple of months. The day after Axe Handle Saturday, when we had a mass meeting at St. Paul AME Church, at the time was on the corner of 13th and Myrtle, we had a representative of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission who came to Jacksonville and who asked if we would give them a cooling off period, if we would call a cooling off period from the sit-ins so that they could talk to some of the city fathers and some of the elected officials to see what they could work out. Well, they did nothing. So after several weeks, we started up again, but we continued. We started off boycotting the downtown. I presided over that mass meeting at St. Paul AME Church, and press out from all over, everywhere, everything was, just a great crowd. So after we started up again, then we got to the biracial committee, and of course some of the store owners and businessmen downtown were upset because they felt like, according to them, we had a gun to their head because we were boycotting downtown. And this is going into, we had gone into the Christmas holidays. Now this was going to after the Christmas holidays. So finally they agreed we would integrate the lunch counters downtown. There were 5 lunch counters, including Coen Brothers. And for 5 days, Marjorie Meeks and I, Marjorie was the secretary to the Youth Council NAACP. She and I both were students at Edward Waters College. We left Edward Waters College and we got a ride or caught the bus or whatever way we got to downtown, and we ate at Woolworth's at the white lunch counter for 5 consecutive days so that whites could get accustomed to seeing blacks eating at the white lunch counter. And after those 5 days, the downtown lunch counters were integrated. This is early 1961. Not the restaurants, not Morrison's cafeteria, but at least it was a start. Except instead of building on that, Jacksonville basically did nothing. That same year, in December of that year, Earl Johnson, who was an NAACP attorney, filed the Braxton suit on behalf of Sadie Braxton's and her 2 children, Daly and Sharon Braxton, to integrate the schools. And the school system proceeded to spend $800,000 then, which would be $6 million in today's money, in fighting the integration of the schools. So that's part and parcel. That was the social and the civic and the political fabric of Jacksonville. When I was writing, it was never about a hot dog and a Coke. Unless we tell it, it never gets told, then covers all of that, starting with James Weldon Johnson. 2/3 of the book deal with subjects that impacted this country with great blacks and revered blacks who not only impacted the city of Jacksonville, but impacted the country. And the last third of the book deals with confronting racism, and then I tell the story about Nathan Bedford Forrest and the story about Bethel and some of the other instances that are misconstrued and actually misinforms people about part of Jacksonville's history.
So you feel that your work as an historian is to set the record straight?
Yeah, you don't. Both of my books were not written based on a bottom line. They were written to set the record straight. And as idealistic as that sounds, it's very important that we do that. I got the opportunity, the honor to nominate Mr. Pearson, who was my mentor, my 8th grade teacher that advised our Youth Council, and also Senator Gerardo, Dr. Gerardo, to the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame, and they were both inducted into the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame. So including Mr. Pearson and Senator Gerardo, Earl Johnson has also been inducted into the Florida Hall of Fame, as has Sally Mathis and James Weldon Johnson and A. Philip Randolph. There are about 24 people or so in the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame. 1/4 of them are from Jacksonville.
Wow.
So Jacksonville has has great legacy and a storied history. And it's not, when you talk about race, when you talk about racism, when you talk about black history, when you talk about civil rights history, the problem many times is that many black folk are uncomfortable hearing about how they were used in the process, and white folk are uncomfortable hearing about how they use black folk in the process. But it is what it is in terms of history. And no matter how uncomfortable it is, we still have to discuss it, and we still have to agree to disagree, but we certainly have to inform before we can move on, and especially in Jacksonville, and folk in Jacksonville don't like to hear me say this, but you never hear anybody use the word progressive and Jacksonville in the same sentence. And there is a reason for that, because Jacksonville does not think progressively.
Right, we need to bring our head along with our feet into the 21st century.
Into the 21st century, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, we are an upper-tiered, we are one of 32 cities in this country that has a NFL football team. That puts Jacksonville in an upper level of municipalities in this country. So you would think that correspondingly Jacksonville would think like that. And unfortunately, it does not.
Right. Well, we so appreciate the time you've taken today to talk to us about this history that so
pleasure.
few are willing to discuss, as you said. But we have one more question for you while we wrap this up. We want to know, Mr. Hurst, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be a doctor.
Ah.
I wanted to be a pediatrician. Because, that was that. I guess in some instances it was a unreachable goal, and I wanted to be something about being a doctor that just resonated with me.
Oh yeah, and that's one of those when you're a kid and you tell people I want to be a pediatrician, they say, that's good.
That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
I started school at 5 and I got skipped, so I was kind of maladjusted. The classroom work didn't make a difference, but you're sitting in the class and all the girls in the class are 2 years older than you. Then that's an adjustment that you have to learn how to make.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Well, Mr. Hurst, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We didn't mention this in the interview with Mr. Hurst, but he was actually the youngest ever president of the Youth Council NAACP. He was 16 when he was the president of that when all this was happening, which is insane.
And he didn't list himself as one of those amazing civil rights stakeholders from Jacksonville, but he really, really is moving into the 21st century, especially. He said so many things that just gave me straight up goosebumps, but one of the biggest things was when he said, I am an advocate for who I am. I think that just sums up the mission of civil rights entirely in one tiny sentence. Yeah, what a guy.
Yeah, man. It was just like, I wish we had it on video, because I was literally sitting there with like my mouth open, like looking back and forth between him and Hurley, like as he was saying these things, like unbelief on my face.
Right, yeah.
Oh my
so
gosh.
again, Mr. Hurst, if you're listening, we really appreciate the time you took today to come into the studio and share a little bit about your work as a civil rights activist and the wonderful things you've done for the people of Jacksonville. Thank you.
Absolutely. It was amazing. And if you want to hear more from Mr. Hurst, he will be here this Saturday at Jack's Book Fest. He's speaking at 2:30 in the Multipurpose Room 1, which is on the conference level.
You don't want to miss this, folks. Hearing Mr. Hurst speak in person is just incredible, and you will learn so much about your city and the things that have happened here and the things that maybe you weren't always aware of happening here. So please make time to come on Saturday at 2:30.
Yeah, and you'll get to ask him some questions yourself if you have any questions for him.
Exactly, and he'll even sign your books.
Oh, yeah, bring your book. That's so cool. Yeah, so don't miss that at Jack's Book Fest. He was here last year for Jack's Book Fest, and it was standing room only.
Yeah.
And so we put him in a larger room this year, so
Yes.
hopefully everyone will get to see him.
The man deserves a larger room. While you're at it, make sure you subscribe to our show, and we'd love it if you rated us and left us a review.
Absolutely. Make sure you follow us at Jack's Library on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.
Check our podcast page, jackspubliclibrary.org/podcast. We'll be linking to all of Mr. Hurst's books. You can check them out from our collection. This podcast was produced by Brian Thomas, a.k.a. BT, a.k.a.
Producer Brian.
Goodbye.